cold rain streaked down the narrow windows of Willow Creek Holding Station, blurring the world outside as if even the night didn't want to look too closely. Harold Bennett sat alone on a metal bench, 65 years old, hands folded, shoulders slightly bowed, not in guilt, but in exhaustion. He wasn't sentenced, not yet, but the weight of the accusation pressed just as hard. They said he had killed a powerful developer by the lake. They said the evidence was clear enough, a smudged fingerprint, a deposit he couldn't explain, a story that moved too fast for truth to keep up. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. "Mr. Bennett," the deputy said, voice flat, "before we transfer your file to the court, do you have any requests?" Harold hesitated, then spoke softly. "Let me see my dog. Just once." The room went still. A German shepherd named Duke, old, loyal, and waiting somewhere in the rain, the only witness who had never doubted him. That single request would set in motion a chain of events no one in Willow Creek expected, one that would expose lies, test faith, and remind everyone watching that sometimes God sends truth not through power, but through loyalty. Before we begin, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell us where you're watching from. Cold rain lashed the narrow windows of Willow Creek Holding Station, driven sideways by a restless wind, as if the night itself were trying to force its way inside. Harold Bennett sat motionless on a steel bench bolted to the concrete floor, his hands folded loosely in his lap, wrists still bearing faint red impressions from the cuffs that had been removed hours earlier. At 65, his body carried the quiet wear of a man who had lived honestly and worked with his hands, broad shoulders that had softened with age, a spine that still held stubbornly straight, and a face carved with deep lines earned from decades of sun, wind, and restraint. His hair, once dark brown, was now almost entirely silver, cropped short in a practical style he had kept since his years working maintenance around the lake. A neatly trimmed gray beard framed a jaw that still hinted at strength, though tonight it trembled slightly, betraying exhaustion he refused to acknowledge. Harold was not a man prone to dramatics. He had survived layoffs, storms, a heart scare 5 winters ago, and the quiet grief of burying friends before their time. Yet sitting there in borrowed clothes that smelled faintly of disinfectant, he felt something far worse than fear. He felt erased. He had not been sentenced. He had not even been formally charged. He was being held, temporarily, they said, while prosecutors prepared for a preliminary hearing that would decide whether his life would fracture permanently or be returned to him with an apology no one would ever fully mean. But temporary confinement had a way of sinking into the bones. Each passing hour stretched like damp concrete, heavy and cold, until time itself seemed to press down on his chest. He was accused of murdering Derek Halston, a name that had echoed through Willow Creek for years like a church bell rung too often. Halston had been a wealthy developer, loud in his confidence, immaculate in tailored coats, the kind of man who spoke about progress while quietly hollowing out the land beneath it. When Derek Halston was found dead near the lakeside property he intended to turn into a private resort, the town had demanded an answer before the rain had even washed the blood away. Harold, with his proximity to the site and his inconvenient integrity, had become the answer they could live with. The evidence against him sounded persuasive when recited quickly. A partial fingerprint, blurred and incomplete, lifted from a metal object collected in the rain. A bank deposit that Harold could not immediately explain, though it later turned out to be a delayed insurance reimbursement. A neighbor who claimed to have overheard raised voices days earlier. Each piece alone was weak, but together they formed a story neat enough for people who needed one. Harold understood stories. He had spent his life repairing the aftermath of other people's decisions, quietly fixing fences and docks while rumors spread unchecked. What he could not understand was how easily truth bent under the weight of convenience. A uniformed sergeant stopped outside the holding area, his boots squeaking faintly on the polished floor. He was a young man, maybe early 30s, with close-cropped hair and the restless energy of someone still deciding who he wanted to be. He cleared his throat, professional but not unkind. "Mara Bennett," he said, avoiding eye contact in the way people often did when they felt unsure of their own authority. "Before we move your file upstairs, you're entitled to make a request. Nothing guaranteed, but I'll note it." Harold looked up slowly. His eyes were a clear, faded blue, the kind that had seen too many seasons to be easily clouded. For a moment he considered asking for a phone call, a lawyer, anything sensible. Instead, his voice came out rough, scraped thin by the night. "I'd like to see my dog," he said, "just for a minute." The sergeant hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "Your dog?" "Yes," Harold replied. "Duke. He's a German shepherd, old fellow. He won't cause trouble." The request traveled quickly, passing through the invisible hierarchy of the station until it reached Deputy Chief Marlene Shaw. Shaw had been with Willow Creek law enforcement for nearly 30 years, a woman in her late 50s with a tall, angular frame and posture that suggested discipline had long ago become instinct. Her dark hair, streaked with gray at the temples, was always pulled back into a severe knot that revealed a face built for command, sharp cheekbones, steady brown eyes, and a mouth that rarely betrayed what she felt. Among her officers she was known as immovable, a brick wall against excuses and emotional displays, but walls, like people, sometimes cracked under pressure they did not acknowledge. Marlene read the note twice, then looked up toward the rain-streaked windows. She had reviewed Harold Bennett's file earlier that evening. Too clean, she had thought, too orderly. Life was rarely that accommodating. After a long moment she sighed and picked up the phone. "Call his wife," she said to the sergeant. "If she can bring the dog here within the hour, supervised, I'll allow a brief visit." Across town, beneath towering pine trees that swayed and whispered in the storm, Evelyn Bennett stood barefoot in the kitchen of the small house she had shared with Harold for over 40 years. Evelyn was 62, slender and slightly stooped from years of tending gardens and lifting more than she admitted. Her auburn hair, once vibrant, had softened into a muted copper, worn long and usually braided loosely down her back. Her skin was pale, freckled across the nose and hands, marked by sun and time rather than neglect. She had gentle eyes, the kind that reflected concern even when she smiled, and a quiet strength that revealed itself not in grand gestures but in endurance. When the phone rang near midnight, she answered it already, bracing for impact, her heart having learned the rhythm of bad news. She listened without speaking, her free hand gripping the edge of the counter until her knuckles whitened. When the call ended, she remained still, breathing shallowly, as if movement might shatter what little balance she had left. Harold wanted to see Duke, That single detail pierced her far more deeply than any legal update could have. Duke was not just a dog. He was the constant between them, the silent witness to their life. The muddy mornings, the quiet griefs, the unspoken fears. Evelyn pressed her fingers to her lips, swallowed hard, then wiped her face with the heel of her hand. Whatever fear threatened to paralyze her dissolved into resolve. Duke lay near the back door, his large body curled on an old blanket. At 9 years old, he carried the dignified bulk of an aging German shepherd, thick black and tan coat peppered with gray along his muzzle, intelligent amber eyes that followed Evelyn even in sleep, ears scarred slightly from an incident years earlier during a flood rescue that had left him limping for weeks. His movements were slower now, joints stiff in the mornings, but there was nothing dull about him. Duke had the presence of a veteran who never forgot his duty. When Evelyn whispered his name, he rose immediately, tail thumping once against the floor, alert and expectant. She pulled on her raincoat, grabbed Duke's leash, and knelt in front of him, pressing her forehead briefly to his. "We're going to see Harold," she murmured, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. Duke's ears pricked forward and he let out a low, hopeful whine. Together they stepped into the rain, unaware that this small act of loyalty would begin to unravel a lie carefully stitched together by fear and ambition. As Evelyn locked the door behind them and guided Duke toward the truck, she made a silent promise, not to the law, not to the town, but to the man she loved, that she would not let the night decide their future. The access road to Willow Creek Holding Station cut through the hills like a blade wrapped in water, slick asphalt reflecting the red pulse of warning lights and the pale wash of rain-soaked headlights. Evelyn Bennett drove with both hands tight on the wheel, her shoulders rigid beneath her raincoat as gusts of wind shoved against the truck's frame. The wipers worked furiously, but the rain kept returning, relentless, as if determined to obscure everything that lay ahead. In the back seat, Duke sat upright despite the jolting turns, his broad chest steady, amber eyes fixed on the streaked window. He did not whine or shift the way nervous dogs did. It was as though he were not watching the storm at all, but peering through it, searching for something hidden beyond the veil of rain. Duke's age showed most clearly when he moved. At 9, his once effortless power had given way to careful deliberation. His back legs stiffened in cold weather, and his breathing deepened after exertion, but his posture remained unmistakably that of a working dog, alert, purposeful, disciplined. His coat was thick and weather-resistant, black saddle glossy even under dim light, tan legs dusted faintly with mud from the yard. A pale scar curved along his left ear, a reminder of the flood rescue years earlier when debris had slammed into him as he dragged a trapped child toward safety. That night had changed him. Afterward, he had become quieter, more watchful, as if he had learned how fragile the world truly was. Harold had once joked that Duke had grown wiser than both of them combined. Evelyn believed it had been the moment Duke decided his duty extended beyond obedience. It became protection. Evelyn felt the familiar ache in her chest as she drove, a pressure born not just of fear, but of anger she rarely allowed herself to feel. She was not a loud woman. Her strength had always lived in patience, in staying when leaving would have been easier. But as the truck slid through standing water and the dark silhouette of the station rose ahead, something inside her hardened. They had taken Harold without certainty, held him without proof, and now expected compliance wrapped in courtesy. She would give them courtesy, but she would not give them silence. The security gate loomed, its metal bars gleaming wetly beneath overhead lights. Evelyn slowed, rolled down the window, and spoke calmly to the officer who approached, a young woman with a narrow face and hair tucked beneath her cap. The officer glanced from Evelyn to Duke, then back again, curiosity flickering across her features. "Ma'am, we're not usually—" she began, then stopped as Duke met her gaze, still and composed. There was nothing aggressive in his stance, only an unspoken confidence that unsettled her slightly. She cleared her throat, checked her clipboard, and nodded. "Go ahead. Park in visitor." Inside the station, the smell of damp clothing and disinfectant hung thick in the air. The rain followed them in, dripping from Duke's fur onto the tile floor, leaving darkened paw prints behind. A few officers glanced up from their desks. One, a broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and tired eyes, muttered to his colleague, "That's a serious-looking dog." The other snorted quietly. If he could talk, he'd probably ask for a lawyer. The attempt at humor fell flat, but it broke the tension enough for Evelyn to exhale. Deputy Chief Marlene Shaw met them near the corridor leading to the holding area. Up close, Marlene was even more imposing, tall, her uniform crisp, every movement economical. Her face betrayed little, but her eyes lingered briefly on Duke, assessing him with the practiced instinct of someone who had spent a lifetime reading danger. "You have 15 minutes, she said to Evelyn, her voice firm but not unkind. "He's been cooperative. Let's keep it that way." Evelyn nodded, grateful for the professionalism, even as her heart hammered. The visitation room was small, bare except for a metal table bolted to the floor and a few mismatched chairs. When the door on the opposite side opened and Harold stepped in, Evelyn felt the breath leave her lungs. He looked smaller somehow, as if the walls had already begun to press in on him. The lines on his face were deeper, shadows pooling beneath his eyes, but his gaze sharpened instantly when he saw her, and then softened completely when he saw Duke. For a fraction of a second, Duke froze. His body went rigid, muscles coiling beneath his coat, ears pricked forward. Then the years fell away. With a low, breathy sound that was half whine, half sob, he surged forward. The leash slipped from Evelyn's hand as Duke closed the distance and pressed himself against Harold. Front paws braced against his chest, tail sweeping the air in wide, frantic arcs. The impact knocked one of the chairs backward with a clang, but no one intervened. Harold laughed, the sound breaking and wet as he wrapped his arms around Duke's thick neck, burying his face into the familiar warmth of fur. "Oh, you old menace," Harold murmured, his voice trembling despite himself. "You act like I vanished off the face of the earth." Duke responded by licking his chin insistently, whining softly as though trying to confirm that this was not another cruel trick of scent and memory. His entire body shook with the effort of holding himself together. Evelyn stood by the door, one hand pressed to her mouth, torn between laughter and tears. In that moment, the sterile room felt briefly sacred. Whatever power the law claimed, it could not touch what passed between the man and the dog. Something older, purer, and utterly indifferent to procedure. Even Marlene Shaw, watching from the corridor, turned her head slightly, pretending to check her watch. As the initial rush of reunion eased, Duke's behavior changed. He pulled back just enough to sniff Harold more carefully, his nose moving methodically along Harold's torso, pausing at the jacket draped over the chair. It was Harold's own jacket, returned earlier after processing, a heavy canvas coat darkened by age and use. Duke lowered his head, nostrils flaring. A low rumble vibrated in his chest, so quiet it was almost imperceptible. Harold frowned slightly. "What is it, boy?" he asked, stroking Duke's head. Duke did not respond to the touch as he normally would. Instead, he pressed his nose firmly against the sleeve, inhaling deeply, then drew back with a sound that was unmistakably displeased. His growl was not directed at any person in the room. It was aimed at the jacket itself. Evelyn felt a chill run through her despite the warmth of the building. "He did that before," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. The night they came for you, he wouldn't leave your coat alone." Marlene stepped closer, her expression sharpening. "Before how?" she asked. Evelyn hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "The night Derek Halston died," she said. "Harold came home late. Duke kept tugging at that jacket like he was trying to pull it off him. I thought he was just restless. He's never done it before or since. Until now." Duke pawed at the sleeve, his movements insistent but controlled, eyes flicking between Harold and Evelyn, as if urging them to understand something he could not articulate. His growl deepened briefly, then faded into an uneasy whine. Marlene did not speak immediately. She crouched slightly, bringing herself closer to Duke's level, careful not to invade his space. Up close, she noticed the intelligence in his eyes, the focus that went beyond instinct. "He's trained?" she asked Evelyn quietly. "Not formally," Evelyn replied, "but he's perceptive. Always has been." Marlene straightened, her jaw tightening. She had seen enough cases unravel because someone ignored the small, inconvenient details. She glanced at Harold, who was watching Duke with growing concern, then at the jacket. "Time's almost up," she said finally, "but I'm going to make a note of this." Reluctantly, Evelyn clipped the leash back onto Duke's collar. Duke resisted only slightly, leaning into Harold one last time before allowing himself to be guided away. He looked back repeatedly as the door closed behind them, his amber eyes fixed on Harold until the gap disappeared. Harold stood there, hands clenched at his sides, the echo of warmth already fading from his chest. As Evelyn and Duke stepped back into the rain-soaked night, neither spoke. The storm had eased into a steady drizzle, the worst of it passing, but the air felt heavier than before. Duke paused near the truck, lifted his head, and sniffed the wind as if committing the moment to memory. Evelyn rested her hand on his broad back, her voice barely audible. "We'll figure it out," she said, though she was no longer sure whether she was reassuring herself or him. Behind them, inside the station, Marlene Shaw picked up the phone and dialed a number she had not intended to call that night. Some instincts, she knew, did not come from training. They came from paying attention when something refused to stay quiet. In a cramped office that smelled of burnt coffee and old paper, Detective Calvin Rourke sat hunched over a metal desk that had long ago surrendered its original color to scratches and rust, the rain tapping at the window like an accusation that refused to be ignored. Rourke was 59, a man whose body still carried the width and solidity of his younger years, though time had carved him down around the edges. His shoulders were square but heavy, his neck thickened by decades of tension, his hands large and veined, fingers permanently stained with ink and graphite. A grizzled beard framed his mouth, unevenly trimmed, more habit than style, and his hair, once black, had receded into a salt and pepper fringe that curled stubbornly around his ears. His eyes, a dull hazel dulled further by exhaustion, had the look of someone who had spent a lifetime learning which truths were safe to say aloud and which were better buried. For weeks now, sleep had abandoned him. When it came, it arrived in fragments, images of reports half-read, evidence bags mislabeled, a man's face behind holding bars that refused to fade. Rourke had helped build the case against Harold Bennett. He had not done so eagerly, but he had done it efficiently, trusting the machinery of procedure the way one trusts gravity. Evidence in, narrative assembled, file passed along. That was how it was supposed to work. Except something had begun to itch at the back of his mind, a small irritation that grew louder each time he tried to silence it. He reached into a cardboard box at his feet and pulled out the original field report from the night Derek Halston died, its pages yellowed slightly from handling. His eyes went immediately to the margin of page 3, to the faint indentation where a line had once been written, then crossed out so thoroughly it barely registered, unless you were looking for it. Footwear impressions inconsistent with primary suspect, the line had read. Rourke remembered writing it himself, standing ankle-deep in mud by the lakeshore, the rain washing over the ground faster than technicians could photograph it. Harold Bennett's boots had left clean, narrow prints. The impressions near Halston's body were deeper, wider, the tread pattern subtly different. At the time, it had seemed important. Later, it had been labeled inconclusive. And then somewhere between the preliminary report and the prosecutor's brief, it had vanished. Rourke flipped through the file again, jaw tightening. He stood and crossed the room, pulled open a tall metal cabinet whose drawers groaned in protest. Inside were evidence logs stacked in uneven towers. He scanned them until he found what he hadn't wanted to find. A transfer notation stamped in red. Evidence at C-17 relocated to secondary storage due to contamination risk. Signed, Wade Kessman. Rourke exhaled slowly. Wade Kessman was the county prosecutor, a man in his early 40s with immaculate suits, precise diction, and a smile that never reached his eyes. Kessman was lean, sharply featured, his dark hair always perfectly styled, his posture rigid with ambition. He had built his reputation on efficiency and conviction rates, and Rourke had watched more than one questionable case glide past scrutiny under that banner. But this felt different. This felt deliberate. Rourke picked up the phone and dialed a number he had memorized decades earlier. "Marlene," he said when Deputy Chief Marlene Shaw answered. "I need to see Bennett tonight. Something's wrong with the file." There was a pause on the line, long enough for Rourke to imagine her weighing duty against instinct. "You'd better get down here," she replied finally. "We just had an incident." By the time Rourke arrived at Willow Creek Holding Station, the rain had thinned to a mist, the parking lot reflecting the building's lights like a warped mirror. Inside, Marlene met him near the corridor, her face drawn tighter than usual. "The dog," she said quietly, walking beside him. He reacted to Bennett's jacket, not aggression, recognition. Rourke frowned. Dogs don't react like that without a reason. They entered the holding area where Harold sat on the bench, shoulders slumped now that the adrenaline of the visit had drained away. Duke lay at his feet, though as Rourke approached, the dog rose, muscles tensing, eyes fixed not on the detective, but on the jacket folded nearby. Duke moved toward it, nose working furiously, then pawed at the sleeve with sudden urgency. "That again," Evelyn murmured from the doorway. Her face was pale, freckles standing out starkly against her skin. "He did that the night Harold came home late. Wouldn't stop pulling at it." Rourke crouched slowly, careful not to startle Duke. Up close, he could see the dog's age in the faint clouding around the eyes, the slight tremor in his hind legs, but there was nothing weak in his focus. Duke was not confused. He was insisting. "What exactly happened that night?" Rourke asked Evelyn, his voice low. Evelyn swallowed. "Harold came in soaked, said he'd been called out to check a dock light. Duke jumped him like always, but then he started tugging at the coat. Growling, not angry, just urgent. I scolded him, thought he was overstimulated." She shook her head. "I was wrong." Rourke straightened and looked at Marlene. "I want that jacket tested, full panel, not the quick surface scan they already ran." Marlene hesitated only a moment before nodding. "I'll authorize it," she said, quietly. The evidence lab was housed in a low concrete building behind the station, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Technician Sarah Lynn was on duty when the jacket arrived. Sarah was in her mid-30s, slender and precise, with straight black hair cut to her jawline and skin the color of pale porcelain. She wore thick-framed glasses that magnified eyes sharp with focus, and her movements had an economy born of long hours spent with fragile truths. She had grown up the daughter of a chemist and learned early that science, unlike people, did not lie, though it could be made to if mishandled. Sarah took the jacket with gloved hands, her expression neutral. "This was already cleared," she noted. "Cleared quickly," Rourke replied. "I want depth." Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. "All right," she said. "But if there's something here, it was put there intentionally." 2 hours later, the room fell silent as the preliminary results appeared on her screen. Sarah leaned closer, adjusting the display, then looked up slowly. "There's residue," she said. "Not environmental, not from lake water. It's a specialized solvent, one used to break down biological markers, blood, skin cells." Rourke felt the floor tilt beneath him. "Meaning someone cleaned the jacket," he said, "or tried to." "Meaning someone handled it," Sarah corrected, "and didn't want to be identified." Back in the holding area, Harold listened as Marlene relayed the findings. His face drained of color, then hardened. "So someone touched my coat," he said quietly, "after I wore it." Duke let out a low whine, pressing his head against Harold's knee, as if in agreement. Evelyn knelt beside them, her hand trembling as she stroked Duke's fur. "He knew," she whispered. "He smelled it." Rourke nodded slowly. The broken thread was visible now, frayed but unmistakable. Evidence didn't move itself. Files didn't erase themselves. Dogs didn't lie. Someone had entered Harold Bennett's life through the smallest of doors and left a trace they thought no one would notice, except Duke had noticed. And now so had they. As Rourke left the station, the mist lifted just enough for the moon to break through the clouds, pale and watchful. He pulled his coat tighter, already cataloging the steps ahead. Reopen the transfer logs, audit the storage records, follow the signature that had tried to bury the truth. The case against Harold Bennett was no longer intact. It was unraveling, one careful pull at a time. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained the color of unfinished business. A low ceiling of gray clouds pressing down on Willow Creek, as if the night were holding back the rest of its story. Evelyn Bennett drove home slowly, headlights cutting through lingering mist, her thoughts moving faster than the truck. Duke rode in the back as he always had, steady and silent, his chin resting briefly on the edge of the seat before he lifted his head again to watch the road behind them, vigilant even in retreat. When they reached the small house beneath the pines, Duke did not go to his blanket. He lay instead before the front door, body aligned with the threshold, eyes open, unblinking, guarding a space that felt suddenly sacred. He did not sleep. He kept watch like an old sentinel, a Troy without bronze, fueled by loyalty rather than myth. Inside, Evelyn moved through the rooms with careful steps, the quiet amplifying every breath. Her raincoat hung heavy by the door, dripping onto the mat, but she did not remove it right away. Her mind kept circling back to the jacket, to Duke's insistence, to the words Detective Rourke had spoken with such restrained gravity. Someone had touched it and tried to erase themselves. That knowledge settled into her bones. Evelyn was not a suspicious woman by nature. She had lived her life believing that honesty, given time, rose to the surface, but tonight, belief alone felt insufficient. She poured herself a glass of water, hands shaking slightly, then set it aside untouched. If the truth was hiding, she would have to go looking for it. The storage room sat at the back of the house, a narrow space that smelled faintly of oil and cedar, its shelves lined with years of careful accumulation. Harold had always been methodical, labeling boxes in his tidy, slanted handwriting. Tools, lake gear, winter coats. Evelyn stood in the doorway, hesitating. Rummaging through Harold's things felt like an intrusion, a betrayal of the quiet trust they had built over decades. But then she thought of his face behind the glass, of Duke's growl aimed not at people, but at a memory, and her hesitation dissolved. This was not doubt, this was defense. Duke rose from his post at the door and padded down the hallway, nails clicking softly against the wood. He stopped at the threshold of the storage room and looked back at Evelyn, ears forward, tail still. When she stepped inside, he moved with purpose to a low shelf where an old canvas tool bag sat pushed against the wall. The bag was faded green, edges frayed, a familiar companion from years of mending fences and repairing the small wooden boats Harold rented out by the lake. Duke scratched at it once, hard enough to shift it several inches. Then again, he whined, low and insistent. "All right," Evelyn whispered, heart pounding. "All right." She lifted the bag and set it on the work table, unzipping it slowly. Inside were the expected contents: gloves stiff with dried mud, a coil, a rope, a rusted wrench, a flashlight missing its batteries. She emptied it piece by piece, methodical now, until the bag lay flat and seemingly empty. Duke did not relax. He circled once, then pawed at the bottom seam, where the fabric puckered slightly. Evelyn frowned and ran her fingers along the stitching. There, hidden beneath grime and wear, was a small tear she had never noticed. She slipped her fingers inside and felt something cold and unyielding. Her breath caught as she drew it out into the light. It was a tiny piece of metal, no larger than the tip of her thumb, its edges irregular, one side bearing a distinctive etched pattern. Even without expertise, she recognized it as part of something expensive, deliberate, the kind of precision that did not belong in a tool bag. Evelyn's skin prickled. She turned the fragment over and over, dread and clarity arriving together. Duke sat back on his haunches, watching her intently, tail thumping once against the floor, as if to say, "There, that." Evelyn sank onto the stool, the fragment trembling in her palm. Her mind raced back to Rourke's words, to the missing item from the evidence inventory. A piece that should have been sealed, he had said. She did not allow herself to wonder how it had come to be here. She already knew the question that mattered more. She reached for her phone and dialed Rourke's number with fingers that no longer shook. "I found something," she said when he answered, her voice steady now, anchored by resolve. "A metal fragment. Duke led me to it. I think it's from Derek Halston's watch." There was a pause on the line, then a sharp intake of breath. "Don't move it," Rourke said. "I'm on my way." Rourke arrived within 30 minutes, his unmarked sedan crunching softly over the gravel drive. He stepped inside, shoulders squared, the fatigue in his face overridden by adrenaline. Under the kitchen light, he examined the fragment with a magnifying loupe he carried in his pocket. His jaw tightened. "This is a crown stem," he said. "High-end, custom etching. If this matches Halston's watch, it's not just missing evidence, it's planted evidence." They drove together to the lab, Duke riding silently in the back once more. Sarah Lynn met them at the door, hair pulled back, eyes already alert. She took the fragment, ran it through comparative imaging, and brought up the archived photographs of Halston's watch. The match was immediate. "Same alloy," she said, "same pattern. This is from the watch that disappeared from the evidence log." Rourke exhaled slowly, the final piece sliding into place. "Then the jacket wasn't the only thing touched," he said. "Someone had access to Harold's belongings, and they wanted this where it could be found later." He looked at Evelyn. "Except Duke found it first." By dawn, the station buzzed with controlled urgency. Deputy Chief Marlene Shaw authorized a quiet review of evidence transfers, her face composed but eyes hard. She knew what this meant. A planted fragment was not a mistake. It was intent. Rourke dug into storage logs, tracing movements with the patience of a man who had waited too long to listen to his conscience. One name surfaced again and again in authorization chains: Wade Kessman. Kessman arrived mid-morning, summoned under the pretense of routine consultation. He entered the conference room immaculate as ever, dark suit crisp, tie perfectly knotted, hair unmoved by the hour. His features were sharp, his smile polite but controlled. "Detective," he said, nodding to Rourke. "Chief." He did not acknowledge Evelyn, who stood near the window with Duke at her side. Rourke placed the fragment on the table between them. "Do you recognize this?" he asked. Kessman's eyes flicked down for a fraction of a second too long. "Looks like metal," he replied lightly. "I'm sure you'll tell me what you think it is." "It's from Derek Halston's watch," Rourke said. "The one listed in initial reports but never entered into evidence. We found it in Harold Bennett's tool bag." The room went quiet. Kessman's smile thinned. "Are you accusing my office of mishandling evidence?" he asked. "I'm accusing someone of planting it," Rourke said, "and I'm asking who had access." Kessman leaned back, crossing his arms. "This is speculation. You have no chain of custody." Marlene spoke then, her voice calm but unyielding. "We do," she said. "Transfers authorized under your signature. Secondary storage, contamination claims. She slid a folder across the table. And now this. Kessman's gaze hardened. Be careful, he said quietly. Careers have been ruined by less. Evelyn stepped forward before Rourke could respond. She placed a hand on Duke's collar, grounding herself. My husband is being held on a story, she said, and your evidence just lost its ending. Duke lifted his head, amber eyes fixed on Kessman, not growling, not moving, simply watching. Kessman shifted, uncomfortable under that gaze, and stood abruptly. I have nothing further to add, he said. Consult your supervisors. He left the room, the door closing with a soft, definitive click. By afternoon, Rourke filed an emergency motion to reevaluate Harold's detention based on newly discovered evidence. He called in favors, pushed paper, refused to be placated. The fragment had flipped the trap. What had been built to ensnare Harold now tightened around its architect. As evening fell, Evelyn returned home with Duke, exhaustion settling in, but tempered by something new. Momentum. Duke resumed his place by the door, eyes half-lidded now, finally allowing rest. Evelyn sat beside him on the floor, fingers threading through his thick fur. Good boy, she whispered. Duke's tail thumped once, softly. Somewhere in the county building, files were being opened that had not seen light in years. Somewhere else, a story was being rewritten, not by force, by attention. And a small shard of metal, rescued from a forgotten seam, had begun to tell the truth. The supplemental hearing convened at Ridgeport County Courthouse barely 48 hours after the fragment surfaced, so quickly that even the most complacent residents sensed heat beneath the marble floors, the smell of a secret exposed too fast to cool. The morning was clean and bright in a way that felt almost accusatory, sunlight pouring across the courthouse steps as if to say that whatever had thrived in shadow would not today. Evelyn Bennett stood near the entrance with Duke at her side, her posture straight despite the tremor in her hands. Duke wore a simple leather collar, worn soft by years of use. His gray-flecked muzzle lifted toward the doors, ears forward, composed as ever. He looked older in the daylight, the faint cloudiness at the corners of his eyes more visible, but there was nothing diminished in his bearing. He stood like a witness who understood the gravity of the room before ever crossing its threshold. Inside, the courtroom hummed with restrained anticipation. Rows of wooden benches held townspeople who had known Harold Bennett for decades, neighbors who had borrowed tools from him, shopkeepers who had trusted him with tabs, lake renters who had waved as he repaired docks at dawn. Their faces carried the complicated mixture of hope and shame that came when certainty cracked. At the front, Judge Naomi Carver took her seat. At 61, Carver had the presence of a woman who had learned to listen past theatrics. She was tall, her silver hair cut neatly at the shoulders, skin lined by time rather than indulgence, eyes sharp and dark beneath arched brows. She wore no jewelry save a simple watch, and carried herself with the economy of someone who disliked waste, of words, of motion, of truth. Her reputation preceded her, no patience for grandstanding, no tolerance for injustice disguised as efficiency. Detective Calvin Rourke rose first, placing his hands on the lectern. He looked older than he had 2 days prior, the weight of responsibility settling visibly into his shoulders. But there was steadiness in him now, a resolve that replaced the doubt that had haunted his sleep. He spoke without flourish, laying out the sequence with care. The evidence transfers to secondary storage under contamination claims, the missing inventory entry for Derek Halston's watch, the solvent residue found on Harold's jacket indicating attempted erasure of biological markers, and finally the metal crown stem retrieved from Harold's tool bag, located not by chance, but by a dog trained by life itself to notice what did not belong. Evelyn listened, breathing shallowly. Duke pressed close to her leg. When Rourke described Duke's reaction to the jacket, the room shifted subtly. People leaned forward. Judge Carver's gaze flicked once to the dog, then back to Rourke, as if noting a variable she would weigh later with care. Wade Kessman stood to object, his movements precise, controlled. In the stark light of the courtroom, his immaculate suit appeared almost severe, his dark hair perfectly set, his angular features arranged into a practiced mask of confidence. He spoke sharply, dismissing the findings as circumstantial, warning against anthropomorphizing canine behavior, cautioning the court against conspiracy thinking. But the more he spoke, the more his words felt like accelerant. Each objection drew attention to what he sought to minimize. Each interruption underscored his investment. Rourke waited, then delivered the final blow with measured restraint. He introduced newly recovered footage from a parking lot camera near Harold's home, overlooked at first due to a corrupted timestamp, now restored by County IT. The video showed a tall man in a dark jacket approaching Harold's truck late on the night of the murder, moving with practiced efficiency. He did not linger. He did not hesitate. He did exactly what someone paid to clean problems would do. Rourke then traced a phone number linked to that man, a burner device pinging off towers near Derek Halston's property in the days leading up to the death, and finally connecting to a web of business partners whose financial exposure would have exploded had Halston gone public with his plans to expose irregularities. Names appeared on the screen, murmurs rippled through the room. Judge Carver raised a hand. Silence fell. She leaned forward slightly, hands folded. "Mr. Kessman," she said, her voice calm and cool, "the court will hear argument, but it will not ignore evidence because it is inconvenient." She turned to Harold. He stood when addressed, his frame still straight despite the hours and the strain. In the light, the lines of his face softened. He looked like what he was, a man worn by work and worry, not by guilt. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, his blue eyes clear though rimmed with red. Duke rose with him instinctively, then sat at Evelyn's whispered command, gaze never leaving Harold. "Mr. Bennett," Judge Carver said, "you are not convicted, and based on what this court has heard today, you should not remain detained another minute." She paused, then struck the gavel. The sound was crisp, decisive, final. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Evelyn's breath came out in a single shaking exhale that turned into quiet tears, not of collapse, but of release. Duke surged forward, not in panic this time, but in certainty, circling Harold once, twice, then pressing his head into Harold's open palm. Harold knelt despite himself, one hand buried in Duke's thick fur, the other braced against the floor as if grounding himself to the present. "All right," he murmured, voice breaking. "All right." Outside, the town gathered as Harold stepped into the sun a free man. There were no cheers, no spectacle, just the soft sound of breath held too long finally released. On the drive home, the sky widened, blue cutting clean through the last of the clouds. The road was Imperfect, patched and worn, but it led forward all the same. At the house beneath the pines, Duke resumed his post by the door out of habit, then seemed to reconsider, following Harold instead into the kitchen, where Evelyn poured coffee with hands that finally steadied. Rourke arrived briefly, standing awkwardly by the counter, eyes downcast. "I'm sorry," he said simply. Harold studied him, then nodded. "Fix it," he replied. Rourke nodded back. That would be enough. Later, as dusk softened the edges of the day, Duke lay at Harold's feet, head resting against his boot, amber eyes half closed. Evelyn sat nearby, fingers interlaced, watching the light move across the floor. There was exhaustion here and work yet to come, and scars that would not fade quickly. But there was also something newly present, something earned, the quiet knowledge that truth could be carried patiently by the most loyal among us and delivered intact when it mattered most. The sky outside cleared completely as night settled in, not the dramatic kind of clarity that promised perfection, but the honest kind that allowed tomorrow. And the door, once shut by fear and convenience, stood open at last. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or blinding light. Sometimes they come quietly, through a wife who refuses to surrender her faith, through patience that does not grow bitter, and through 4 loyal paws that never learned how to lie. When human systems fail, God often chooses humbler messengers to remind us that truth does not need noise to survive, and justice is never lost. It is only waiting to be revealed. In everyday life, we all stand in unseen courtrooms. We are judged by misunderstandings, rushed conclusions, and silent accusations no one hears. In those moments, it can feel as though every door has closed. Yet faith teaches us this: if we continue to love, to endure, and to pay attention to the smallest signs, a feeling in the heart, a quiet warning, an act of loyalty, God is still working, patiently and precisely, beyond what we can see. If this story touched you, please share it, so hope can reach someone who needs it today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, or about a small miracle you've witnessed in your own life. And subscribe to the channel to continue these stories of faith, devotion, and truth restored. May God bless you and your family, grant you peace in the storm, light when the path is unclear, and the strength to never let go of what is right. Amen.